We are delving back into the wide world of IEMs. If you've been waiting for more planar driver options, then here's yet another for your consideration. This is the BASN MT Pro. This IEM retails for about $220. BASN sent me the MT Pro to review. Let's see what it can do. BASN promises that the MT Pro will produce, quote, highly detailed sound with impactful bass. They claim that this IEM uses a newly designed driver, but BASN does not say that it is a proprietary in-home driver. Apparently, the MT Pro will provide, quote, powerful sound and tonal perfection, which BASN says is perfect for musicians, drummers, and singers. The company says that this IEM has a, quote, smooth, musical, and warm sound, which brings your music to life. They promise a wealth of mid-range detail and energetic treble. BASN also says that the IEM has, quote, a fairly neutral sound signature that is easy to listen to for extended periods. Obviously, there's a lot of marketing going on. BASN, on the one hand, says that this IEM is fairly neutral, but also claims that the treble is energetic, yet the sound is soft. There's some confusion about what this IEM actually sounds like. But one thing they do emphatically promise is that this IEM will produce details. We shall see. The MT Pro, like a lot of planar IEMs currently in the market, is a fairly large device. It's got an enlarged bean-shaped design. The MT Pro is made entirely of metal, which is smooth to the touch. This IEM is hardly form-fitting in the ear cavity. It will jut out, and unless you find a secure ear tip, might even dislodge. The MT Pro comes in a metal protective case. This case has felt lining with 3 deep pockets for storage. You get 2 MMCX cables. They're both well-made, thick, and transmit little microphonics. You also get a 3.5mm to 1/4 inch adapter, a cleaning brush, a cable pull-out clamp, and numerous ear tips. The ear tips consist of 3 types of silicone molding. One is the typical ear tip design. A second has 2 flanges, and the third has 3 flanges. These flanges theoretically help with achieving better isolation and fit, though your mileage will vary. Finally, you also get some foam ear tips. As for comfort, I thought that the MT Pro was pretty easy to wear. Once I found a few ear tips that securely kept the IEM in place, I could not dislodge them even when vigorously shaking my head. I could wear this IEM for about 2 to 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, BASN did a pretty good job in build and accessories. I don't have any complaints with what you get in the box, and certainly we see far more effort here than from some big-name brands that charge a lot more money. To test the MT Pro, I used it with my RME 80i2 DAC, Load 2 PAW S1, Eco Zerta ITM03, and Astel & Kern SA700. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. A simple dongle DAC is sufficient for this IEM. There's no need to spend money on more powerful gear to drive it. BASN says that this IEM has a robust or impactful bass. My tests show it has a close to neutral response. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The MT Pro presented this detail, but it was a little bit quieter than on the more neutral Moondrop Quarks. Transients was faster on the MT Pro than the Quarks and was consistent with other planar drivers. When the crescendo hit, the MT Pro made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible but did not drown out the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling barbell sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The MT Pro presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the IEM rendered them all similarly. The various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike melded with the next. The drum strikes had a hard thudding sound, similar to that of the Quarks. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the MT Pro presented the sub-bass, but the transients was faster than what I heard on the Quarks. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the middle of a medium-sized room. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there is any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I couldn't hear any distortion. Overall, the MT Pro appears to have close to neutral bass with about average clarity in this region. My tests indicate that the mids are fairly neutral, but with a marginal sibilance emphasis. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The MT Pro presented both details and emphasized the sibilance by a few decibels. The MT Pro's sibilance rendition was a little bit greater than what I heard on the Quarks. Orla's voice was one step ahead of the instruments. The Quarks, in comparison, also presented Orla's voice one step ahead of instruments. The MT Pro rendered all the instruments clearly, though there was some melding among their notes. The Quarks were not as clear as the MT Pro. In Want You Back by Haim, the MT Pro again showed that it does slightly emphasize vocal sibilance. This was a few decibels greater than what I heard on the Quarks. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The MT Pro rendered this detail. There are two backup vocalists, one in either channel. The MT Pro initially presented all three vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice that, with close concentration, I could still pick apart. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano melded their notes, but none of these instruments appeared to be muddy or veiled. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the MT Pro presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments were clear. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was not emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The MT Pro just barely let me hear that second voice. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths, and the MT Pro presented this detail. Overall, the MT Pro seems to have close to neutral mids. Female vocals might receive a hint of sibilance emphasis. BASN says that the treble is energetic. My test suggests that this IEM has neutral-ish lower treble with a bit of emphasis in the mid to upper treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the MT Pro presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. The higher-pitched notes seemed a bit emphasized, louder than what I heard on the more neutral Quarks. This difference was not significant but noticeable in an A/B test. On the MT Pro, the timpani was audible but did not drown out the other elements. I heard the various group sets clearly, though of course individual instruments were not discernible. The MT Pro has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the MT Pro made the piano sound like it was 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were similar to what I heard on the Quarks. The cello was as loud as the piano and sounded, for the lack of better terminology, smooth. Both instruments remained clear and distinct. I heard most of the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. Some of these details seemed pushed back or less obvious. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the MT Pro rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass one step behind. All instruments were clear, and none sounded veiled in the mix. The saxophone was the loudest, most obvious element in the mix. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were slightly louder than what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals were the second most obvious instrument in the mix and vied for attention with the saxophone. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The MT Pro was able to produce those differences. Overall, the MT Pro seems to have close to neutral lower treble, but a marginal emphasis elsewhere. The treble did not sound harsh or piercing, even at high volumes. BASN says that the MT Pro has a detailed mid-range and, quote, a highly detailed sound. I think that will depend on whether you've been using generic IEMs before trying the MT Pro. While I agree that the MT Pro does provide details, it is not a detail-oriented, analytical IEM. Details, for instance, are not crammed into your skull. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of brass, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. Sometimes subtle details, such as layered vocals and varying sounds of cymbal strikes, can be audible. But other times details are not any more obvious than on cheaper alternatives. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The WGT2, presents 9 to 10 footsteps. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, and the The-Audio Legacy 2 present 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, and Triple Win Melee each present 5 to 6. And the MT Pro rendered 8 to 9 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the Tin Hi-Fi T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems clear to me that the MT Pro has above average detail retrieval. Changing ear tips or insertion depth and your own music will render different results. BASN says that the MT Pro has wide soundstage. My test suggests that this IEM has above average soundstage. However, the MT Pro does not present a 3D experience. While you might hear some width and depth, this IEM does not excel at verticality. Of course, the original recording has a lot to do with that as well. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and Heidi's MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and 05S are average at best. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I think the MT Pro is wider than the Moondrop Aria. However, it appeared to me that the Tin Hi-Fi T2 was wider than the MT Pro. BASN says that the MT Pro has a neutral sound signature. They also claim that it has energetic treble, a soft and natural sound, and a balanced tuning. This seems to be a little contradictory. In my view, I think the MT Pro has a fairly neutral presentation with slight deviations. The bass I think sounds close to neutral. It is very rare that I find a planar headphone or IEM with neutral rendition in this region, and I think the MT Pro comes pretty close to the mark. Transients is still fairly quick, but sub-bass rumble and drum impacts are not weak or reduced. Separation and clarity between sub-bass and mid-bass is about average. The mids are again close to neutral. Vocals stand 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments, which generally sound clear. There is some melding among mate-centric elements, but nothing sounds muffled. Female artists might get a slight emphasis in sibilance. The treble seems close to neutral in the lower treble, with some emphasis in the mid to upper treble. This push is not seemingly significant, and therefore I never found it to be harsh or piercing. The MT Pro has above average detail and soundstage. I don't think this is a balanced tune IEM. In my opinion, a balanced tuning is one that noticeably deviates from what I consider neutral, and the MT Pro doesn't. Instead, I'd call the MT Pro a fair representation of neutral, but with a marginal push in treble for that air some people might like. As for the promise that the MT Pro is smooth, well, I think that will depend on your preferences. While I don't think that this sibilance emphasis was distracting or piercing, those who are very sensitive to it might still find it annoying. And I'm sure there are those who cannot stand any treble emphasis and might not be happy with even the MT Pro's slight push. We should compare new products as often as possible. That's the only way to see how things really fit. Here, we will compare the MT Pro against the Let's Shure S12 Pro, the Moondrop Stellaris, and the Sennheiser Timeless. For these tests, I plugged each IEM into a passive AB switch that was connected to my RME802 DAC. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match. The S12 and MT Pro have slightly different rendition of bass. While both are close to neutral, the S12 has more obvious separation of sub-bass from mid-bass. Transients is similarly quick on both. There's more bass bleed into the mids on the MT Pro compared to the S12. Drum hits are sharper on the S12. The mids are different. The S12 has forward mids while the MT Pro is fairly neutral. Vocals stand further apart, more clear on the S12. The S12 has greater emphasis of sibilance for both male and female artists. In contrast, the MT Pro has a slight emphasis for female singers. The treble is a little different. The MT Pro has somewhat neutral lower treble with a marginal emphasis in the mid to upper treble. The S12 Pro also has an emphasis in this region, but it sounds sharper, more energetic. These two IEMs have similar detail retrieval and soundstage, but the S12 is generally slightly clearer. The Stellaris has a noticeably different bass response. It has a bass roll-off compared to the MT Pro. Transients is similarly quick, however. Drum impacts sound similar, but the Stellaris' might just be a tad sharper. Clarity in this region is slightly more obvious on the Stellaris. The mids are different. The Stellaris has forward mids and vocals are well ahead of instruments. The Stellaris emphasizes sibilance for male and female singers more so than the MT Pro. Clarity and separation in this region, however, is similar between the two. The treble is different. The Stellaris is mostly neutral in the low and mid treble, but has an emphasis in the upper treble. The MT Pro, in contrast, is fairly neutral in the lower treble, but has emphasis in the mid and upper treble. Clarity is slightly more obvious on the MT Pro in this region. The MT Pro has greater detail retrieval. In my new light test, the Stellaris rendered 6 footsteps. Both IEMs have similar soundstage. The Timeless has a sub-bass roll-off compared to the MT Pro. Overall, the MT Pro appears to be closer to neutral, with harder drum hits and slightly more obvious bass rumble. Clarity and separation in this region, however, is similar. The mids are a bit different. The Timeless has forward mids while the MT Pro has a more neutral presentation. Both IEMs emphasize sibilance in similar degrees. Mid-centric clarity is more obvious on the MT Pro. The treble is different. Overall, the Timeless has a more neutral rendition. The MT Pro has an emphasis in the mid to upper treble. Clarity here is a bit more obvious on the MT Pro. The Timeless and MT Pro aren't too far apart in detail retrieval, but the MT Pro does provide more and slightly clearer rendition. In my new light test, the Timeless presented 8 footsteps. Both IEMs have similar soundstage. Hopefully, comparisons like these will help you make an informed decision on what to buy. Frankly, all 4 IEMs have different sound signatures. They share some similarities, but none is a copy and paste of any other. You may like or hate any or all of these options. This is my first time listening to a BASN product. They make lots of entry-level IEMs, and I'm sure plenty of people find enjoyment from them. So, when they contacted me to review their newest planar IEM, I was both interested and skeptical. Their somewhat confusing marketing left me wondering what to expect. But I'm happy to say that the MT Pro surprised me. This is a fairly neutral IEM, which is a nice change of pace from the typical hi-fi tuning. The bass is close to neutral. Transients is the typical planar style. The mids are also quite neutral, but with a hint of sibilance. The treble has a marginal emphasis in the mid to upper treble region. This IEM renders above average detail and soundstage. While I cannot say that this IEM is categorically smooth sounding, I can say that it is not a harsh sound signature, nothing like the Ten Hi-Fi T2 might be, or how some might describe the Stellaris or Muse Hi-Fi Power. BASN provides a product that seems well made and packed with useful accessories. While you might not enjoy this sound signature, and you certainly can be happy with many of the multitude of other options, the MT Pro, I think, is a good IEM. For around $200, and it seems you can find it a bit cheaper on Amazon, I think the MT Pro is value.